Stations bring you Elmer Davis and the news.
The recent report from Paris that the Allies are contemplating an attempt at the encirclement of Russia by attacks from the north and south found support in various pieces of evidence today. Reports from the Arctic Ocean seem to make it fairly clear that a British squadron is watching the Russians and the German ships who have taken refuge with them at Petsamo and Murmansk. Leslie Hoare-Belisha, the lately displaced British War Minister, told his constituents at Devonport that the Allies could shorten the war by well-planned, adequate, and decisive action to help Finland, but that any half-hearted intervention would be abortive from the start. The risk of helping Finland might be great, he said, but the risk in not helping might be greater. As once Finland fell, he argued, Germany and Russia together would be able to dominate Scandinavia. This argument seems well-reasoned, but even if, as has been suggested in some quarters, the speech was made with the approval of the British government to test public sentiment, it's a question whether it is not now too late to send the Finns help in the quantity that they need, especially if the Swedes and Norwegians, under German pressure, still refuse to allow Allied troops and war materials to cross their territory. We have no late news from the front in Finland, but earlier today, the Finns maintained, without contradiction from Moscow, that they were still holding the line some 6 or 7 miles from Viipuri. Today's attack seemed to have been chiefly between two lakes in the middle of the Karelian Isthmus, where the Finns say the Russians were thrown back with heavy loss. And the Finns insist that they still hold the coastal fortress of Koivisto, whose guns are pounding the attacking forces in the flank and rear. The official Russian news agency TASS denied that Russian planes bombed the Swedish town of Pajala on Wednesday. Even denied that any Russian planes had ever flown over Swedish territory at all. And an attempt was made by implication to represent the whole story as a British invention. The Swedish government, however, which is in no doubt either that Pajala was bombed or as to who bombed it, continues to press its protest in Moscow. Tomorrow, the foreign ministers of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark meet in Copenhagen, and to their originally announced topic of the German submarine war against neutral shipping, they will now probably add discussion of the Finnish situation and of the more vigorous British policy, of which the Altmark case was the first example, but will probably not be the last. Russian newspapers celebrating the anniversary of the establishment of the Red Army took notice of the talk of an Allied offensive against Russia with a warning that if anything of the sort happened, they would make a counteroffensive into enemy territory. So far as the Army goes, this doesn't seem a very serious threat in view of what has happened in Finland. But there was also talk of possible Russian naval action in the Pacific, and that might do a good deal of damage to British seaborne trade. In the Near East, nobody is quite sure yet who's going to line up on which side if war comes. The Romanians are mobilizing, and they were sending forces to their Hungarian border. But it has just now been announced in Bucharest that the Romanian and Hungarian governments have reached agreement to cease all press attacks against each other, and the tension between the two countries over their territorial dispute appears to have relaxed considerably. All telephone communication between Turkey and Europe was cut off tonight. While this may conceivably mean another earthquake, it might also suggest that a censorship is being clamped on while the government takes some sort of action. A broadcast from our correspondent Cecil Brown in Rome tonight called attention to the decisive factor in all these moves in the Near East. Mr. Brown quoted the Italian newspaper Corriere della Sera as saying that all these British and French plans would collapse if the Mediterranean were blocked in the vicinity of Sicily or if hostile warships were operating from the Dodecanesus, the group of islands off the Turkish coast which has been held by the Italians since the War of 1911. It must be quite as clear to the British and French as to the Italians that this would be very dangerous to attempt operations in the Near East without at least the benevolent neutrality of Italy. But we've had no news yet about whatever diplomatic moves may be going on in Rome, except that the Italian liner Rex, which carries Under-Secretary of State Sumner Welles and Ambassador Myron Taylor, was passed through Gibraltar in what seems to be the record time of 3 hours and 40 minutes. The House of Representatives tonight passed the bill extending for 3 years the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act, which now goes up to the Senate. The vote on final passage was 216 to 168, with 5 Republicans and 1 Laborite joining the Democrats in voting for it, and 19 Democrats, 1 Progressive, and 1 Farmer Laborite joining the Republicans against it.
This is the Columbia Broadcasting System.
.8:55 Eastern Time, and Columbia and its affiliated stations bring you Elmer Davis and the news.
With the British and French parliaments reconvening day after tomorrow, it was again reported in London today that their governments would present them with a definite policy for stopping the imports of iron ore from into Germany from Scandinavia, even though that means what is called in London a technical infringement of Norwegian waters. A note to be sent to Norway and Sweden is said to be in preparation, in which the Altmark case and the movements of other German ships will be cited as evidence that Germany has been violating Scandinavian neutrality, and it will be argued that in the face of this, the Allies cannot be expected to remain passive. This as yet is not official, but there's been such persistent talk about it, including the remarks addressed to the neutrals generally by Winston Churchill yesterday, that it looks as if something may really be done. Today's Berlin papers say the neutrals must now expect England and France to attack them with force. It seems very doubtful if any such thing is contemplated. But if the Norwegians should resist by force what the British call a technical infringement of neutrality, the Allies would have either to take action which would disastrously damage their moral standing in the eyes of the world, or else back down and look ridiculous. The British argument, of course, is that an intrusion into Norwegian waters to seize German ships is a much less serious violation of neutrality than the German attacks which have sunk almost 100 Norwegian ships and killed about 400 seamen, and that if one is not resisted, the other should not be either. A good many Norwegians see the point in that, but they've been warned by the German press that if they fail to resist attacks on German ships in their waters, the Germans may have to take action. So apparently, if this policy is once started, Norway is in danger of becoming a battleground, if not being drawn into the war itself. The territory Finland ceded to Russia in the peace treaty was today formally incorporated in the Soviet Karelian Republic, one of the subdivisions of the Soviet Union, which will hereafter be known as the Karelo-Finnish Republic. It was admitted at the meeting of the Soviet Supreme Council that some of the districts annexed were purely Finnish. When the Swedish Parliament meets tomorrow, Foreign Minister Günther is expected to announce that the project for a defensive alliance of Finland, Sweden, and Norway, which Russia vetoed, has been dropped. Meanwhile, the Swedes are rushing defensive preparations and rejuvenating their high command. The Russian Premier Molotov's speech the other day virtually admitted that the war with Finland had been a preventive war, and the Swedes can't tell when the Russians may again decide that they have to prevent something. If there should be fighting in Norway, that decision might come very soon. Argument still goes on over the authenticity of the documents in the German White Book, accusing Ambassador Bullitt of being the architect of the Anglo-Polish alliance and the maker of the war. American correspondents in Berlin were shown what the Germans said were the original documents, the reports of Polish ambassadors about the activity of Bullitt and other American diplomats. Some thought they looked authentic, some not. The Poles still insist that all their Foreign Office records were destroyed or removed beyond enemy reach, and point out that some of the language ascribed to both American and Polish diplomats is typical Nazi phraseology, which it is impossible to imagine a foreigner using. Senator Holt of West Virginia, who was quoted the first day as frankly saying that he believed Bullitt said what was ascribed to him, later amended his statement to say that it sounded very much like him. Naturally, Mr. Bullitt's ideas on European politics in general are pretty well known, and the Germans would not have pinned this story on an American who was pro-Nazi. Some of the general remarks ascribed to Bullitt and other American diplomats are the sort of thing they might have said in a discussion of European political prospects, whether they ever did or not. But a good deal of what they are supposed to have said is quite as implausible as what they are supposed to have done. The Chinese government in Chongqing, the real one, is naturally delighted with the refusal of the United States to recognize the government set up yesterday by the Japanese in Nanking under Wang Qingwei, and they hope that our attitude will make the Japanese army realize the futility of trying to carry out its plans. But Japanese officials said they were not surprised at the refusal of recognition and that they would go right on carrying out their plans. And a notice comes from Mexico City that hereafter no European capitalists will be permitted to enter Mexico. Since the outbreak of the war, European tourists and students have been barred, but capitalists were let in if they were willing to invest $15,000 apiece in Mexican industry. Unfortunately, once they got in, they all treated Mexico as a way station and tried to cross the border into the United States.
This is the Columbia Broadcasting System. 8:55 Eastern Time, and Columbia and its affiliated stations bring you Elmer Davis and the news.
The Emperor of Japan today appointed General Abe, the former Prime Minister, whose special ambassador to the new government the Japanese had set up in China, as his personal representative with supreme authority over the Japanese military and naval forces in the occupied area. And, of course, in fact, if not in theory, supreme authority over Wang Qingwei's government as well. Dispatches from Tokyo say that this means that the period of army control in China has ended, and that irresponsible treatment both of Chinese and foreigners will be ended too. But it also means that the prestige of the imperial throne has been put behind the policy of establishing the new order in East Asia, including the dummy government in China. And thus, according to Japanese constitutional and religious theory, that policy is irreversible and cannot be allowed to fail. Forecasts of the Japanese program say that northern China and Inner Mongolia, nominally under control of Wang Qingwei, will actually be governed by Japanese or their Chinese agents, and that in central China, Wang will have, as the dispatches put it, virtually complete independence so long as he cooperates with Japan. Military operations against the real Chinese government are to be continued, and it's admitted in Tokyo that it may be many years before Chinese resistance is broken. But in the meantime, a vigorous effort is to be made to conciliate foreign powers in the hope that they will lend Dr. Wang's government some money. Especially an attempt will be made to treat Americans well, in pursuance of the Japanese theory that this government and people merely misunderstand Japan's ideals. Whatever may be the success of this policy, the Japanese seem to have a good chance of making friends with the British, at least until this war is over. The recent remark of the British ambassador that Japan and Britain were ultimately striving for the same objective was underlined today by the London Times, which often served as a mouthpiece for the British government in the old appeasement days. Now it describes the Japanese invasion of China and the attempt to set up a phony government in the occupied areas as Japan's great experiment. However, there must be men in Japan who suspect that this form of appeasement may not last long if England wins the war. Meanwhile, a British spokesman said that the Allies had no intention of attempting to land troops in Scandinavia or to police Scandinavian waters. So apparently the London and Paris governments have realized the unwisdom of aggression against neutral Norway to cut off the shipments of iron ore, which within a few weeks Germany will be able to get direct from Sweden through the safe waters of the Baltic. The Germans threaten countermeasures if the British interfere with their trade through Norwegian waters, but it would probably be found in practice that it would be easier for either country to put pressure on Norway than on the enemy. British broadcasts today had a good deal to say about the possibility of hampering Germany's overland imports from the Balkans and the Danube Valley. Offhand, it is hard to see how they could do it, but a German comment possibly gives the answer that, I quote, "The British cannot hope to empty the Balkans like a bucket with panicky purchases, often of useless things," end quote. In this competition for Balkan exports, it's a safe bet that neither side is loading itself up with useless things. Our London correspondent, Mr. Morrow, spoke tonight of the combination of optimism and impatience prevalent in England, but so far it does not seem strong enough to push the government into reckless measures. Representative Hamilton Fish today introduced a resolution calling for an investigation of the German White Book charges and said that if upon investigation the facts warrant impeachment of any ambassador or even of the president, the House should act. Mr. Fish said he could not conceive that the German Foreign Ministry would forge or fabricate documents. His remarks were, of course, extensively quoted in Berlin. Senator Reynolds of North Carolina is worried about the movements of Mr. Sumner Welles. He said he wants to know where Mr. Welles went, with whom he talked, and what was done. The newspaper files could answer his first two questions for him, and we have no evidence so far that anything was done. Senator Wheeler of Montana, speaking today to the Commonwealth Club of San Francisco, where Mr. Roosevelt made about the only speech of his 1932 campaign that foreshadowed the New Deal, Senator Wheeler said he did not believe the president wanted or would take another nomination. Speaking for himself, Mr. Wheeler said that if the party felt he could come near winning, he would take a nomination, but that he wasn't campaigning for it and would rather be a senator than vice president. And John L. Lewis said that unless the Democrats nominated a candidate and adopted a platform satisfactory to labor, there'd be another convention.
This is the Columbia Broadcasting System.
8:55 Eastern Time, and Columbia and its affiliated stations bring you Elmer Davis and the news.
German planes again raided the British naval base at Scapa Flow this evening. The Germans say several ships were hit, one set afire, and another left listing badly. The British say no warship was hit or damaged. No use trying to guess which of these stories is nearer the truth, but the purpose of the attack is evident. Speeches in the British Parliament today forecast that Allied warships would be likely to enter Norwegian territorial waters in the future, as they have already done in the Altmark case, to try to cut off German ships bringing iron ore home from Narvik. And if the Germans could seriously weaken the fleet at Scapa Flow, their own naval forces might hope to try to defend this route. Prime Minister Chamberlain said in the House of Commons that Britain would do everything possible to try to stop this traffic. And Lord Crewe in the House of Lords indicated that the 3-mile limit was not likely to be respected if inconvenient. Mr. Chamberlain further said that the Allies would take suitable measures to keep supplies from reaching Germany by land. These suitable measures meaning the purchase of the export surpluses of neutral countries. For instance, the Allies have already bought the whole Norwegian export supply of whale oil. Further, Mr. Chamberlain said, goods from the whole British Empire would be refused to neutrals unless they would agree to limit their trade with Germany, and the Allies would no longer tolerate what he called the double standard of neutrality created by German practices. This seems likely to go the way of other double standards. All of which is taken as meaning that the war will continue for some time to be chiefly a matter of economic attrition. Once more today, there was heavy artillery fire on the Western Front and a series of air actions about the results of which the stories of the two sides are as usual contradictory. But it doesn't seem to be expected that anybody is preparing for a serious attack. But the intensification of the blockade, whatever it may do to Germany, again puts the small neutrals on the spot, especially the Norwegians, whose parliament met in secret session today to see what could be done about it. Norwegian papers protest against the tightening of the blockade, but it seems unlikely that this will have much effect. An official protest has gone from the Danish government to the British over the recent torpedoing of the German ship Edmund Hugo Stennis, which the Danes say occurred within the 3-mile limit. And at the same time, the Dutch government protested to the Germans against air attacks on Dutch fishing boats and asked for punishment of the aviators. But in the present mood of both belligerents, it looks as if the neutrals will be increasingly squeezed between the two. A Nazi spokesman said tonight that Germany would retaliate with countermeasures for any intensification of blockade practices. German shipping companies announced today that they would start service from Danzig to ice-free ports in southeastern Sweden, from which they can get shipments of ore from the southern Swedish mines. These mines are less important than those in the north, but in a few weeks more, ore from the north can be shipped too through the safe waters of the Gulf of Bothnia and the Baltic. There was no indication of reconstruction of the British cabinet at today's meeting of Parliament, but French politics suddenly flared up when the Radical Socialist Party held a caucus and decided to send a deputation to the former Premier Daladier, now Minister of War in the Reynaud cabinet, to ask him if he would like to head the government again. This is said to be largely the work of Mr. Georges Bonnet, once a well-known appeaser, who was dropped from his post as Minister of Justice in the Daladier cabinet when Reynaud came in. Former Premier Laval is also said to be working to upset Reynaud, hoping to be able to put over the conciliatory policy toward Italy with which he has long been identified. Though Reynaud has lately been reported as trying to conciliate Italy, too. The Reynaud cabinet is believed to be safe till the debate on foreign affairs begins next week, and of course a no from Daladier would squelch the whole movement. Secretary Hull today refused the request of Representative Hamilton Fish that Ambassador Bullitt, who is to fly back to Paris tomorrow, stay here 2 weeks more to testify before a committee which Mr. Fish wants Congress to appoint to investigate the allegations of the German White Book. Mr. Hull said the executive department has accepted Mr. Bullitt's denials of the German story and that he is needed at his post. Neither the Fish resolution nor a somewhat similar one introduced in the Senate by Mr. Reynolds of North Carolina is expected to get very far with the committees to which it's been referred. Admiral Yonai, the Prime Minister of Japan, told reporters that he still hopes Chiang Kai-shek and his colleagues in the Chinese government will abandon their anti-Japanese program and cooperate with the new government set up by the Japanese under Wang Ching-wei. The Wang government, said Admiral Yonai, needs the cooperation of all groups to build a greater Chinese state, but he admitted that he didn't really expect Chiang Kai-shek to come over.
This is the Columbia Broadcasting System. 8:55 Eastern Daylight Time, and Columbia and its affiliated stations bring you Elmer Davis and the news.
At the end of the most successful day in the German invasion of Norway, it seems probable that the Germans hold the railroad junction at Dombas, strategic center of the campaign south of Trondheim. A British War Office communique issued at midnight London time says the British resisted any further enemy advances in the Dombas area. It seems likely that they would have denied German claims of the capture of the town if they had been able. It was added, however, that new landings of Allied troops had been made, and this was taken in London as a denial of reports current there during the day that evacuation of all southern Norway was contemplated. The German victory was accomplished when the more northerly of the two flanking columns, striking over from the Öster Valley, made contact this morning with a force that had pushed southward from Trondheim. They met at Ulsberg on the railroad between Sturren and Dombås, and then pushed southward, while at the same time the German force operating in the Gudbrands Valley broke through the Allies at Quam and pushed on for nearly 30 miles. This very rapid advance was obviously made by a motorized column, and it is just possible that Allied reinforcements may come up in time to throw back weak German advanced forces. But the Germans seem to have been strong enough to push through today against what they admit was tough British opposition. It is not certain whether Sturren has yet been taken or not, but the British and Norwegian forces there are certainly surrounded. Until this town falls, the Germans, while they have established contact between southern and central Norway, can't use the easiest route. But Chancellor Hitler's order of the day to the German armies said they had conclusively nullified the Allied attempts to beat Germany to her knees. Elsewhere in Norway, there wasn't much fighting. Some action at Narvik with indeterminate results, and outpost actions north of Steinkjer in which the German advanced forces were thrown back. The British admitted the probable loss of 2 submarines. The Germans claim they sank more than that, and also refer to 6 other ships, perhaps transports, sunk by their bombing planes. But this report, made this morning, may be a duplication of yesterday's story. How much truth there is in these figures from the two sides will probably not be known till the war is over, if then. The British again raided the Oslo airport and obviously have a constantly increasing air force in Norway, but the Germans still have a bigger one. Today they made 6 raids on the British landing base at Namsos despite anti-aircraft fire, wrecking a destroyer and inflicting heavy loss of life. This according to dispatches from Namsos itself. Today's reverses stirred an angry popular reaction in Britain, especially after Prime Minister Chamberlain and War Minister Stanley, questioned in Parliament, said that it was not in the public interest to make a statement about the military situation. Sir Archibald Sinclair, leader of the Liberal Party, speaking at Edinburgh, criticized what he called the false prophets who tell us that Hitler missed the bus. He also referred to suspicions that the expeditionary force, concentrated to go to the help of Finland, had been dispersed before the Germans invaded Norway and had to be reassembled. And he added, I quote, "If the government have muddled this campaign, it will be for Parliament to act objectively, fearlessly, and resolutely in a grand inquest of the nation," end quote. Yet opinion in London seems to be that the Chamberlain ministry will probably survive even these setbacks. At any rate, the British government is preparing for the possibility of having to take on Italy, too. All British shipping, which has hitherto been using the Mediterranean as its road to the Far East, was ordered today to take the longer route around Africa on account of the threatening attitude of Italy, as manifested by the recent declarations of Italian leaders, the constant press campaign, and the unwillingness to resume trade negotiations with England. The British statement said it was hoped that this precaution about the shipping could later be abandoned, but there doesn't seem to be much ground for optimism in the present Italian attitude. The newspaper attacks on both France and England continue, and some people think the decision may be made at a cabinet meeting, which Mussolini has called for tomorrow. The first of Italy's new 35,000-ton battleships, the Vittorio Veneto, mounting 9 15-inch guns, went into service today, and a second will soon be ready. Russia is getting ready to celebrate May Day, and in anticipation, the Communist International has issued a manifesto which criticizes every great power in the world except Germany. The Communists insist that Germany invaded Scandinavia only to counteract Allied violation of Norwegian neutrality, and they throw all the blame on what they call the Anglo-French incendiaries of war. And the American bourgeoisie, according to the Communists, are stretching out their hands to Greenland, Iceland, and the West Indies.
This is the Columbia Broadcasting System.
(8:55 p.m. Eastern Daylight Saving Time). The Columbia Broadcasting System and its affiliated stations bring you the nightly broadcast of Elmer Davis and the news.
Dispatches from Berlin tonight claim that the Germans have taken Dombås and are driving on toward the Allied base at Andelsness, with the Air Force blasting away the opposition in front of them. This is not official. The German Army communique merely says that the British forces near Donbass have been almost completely isolated and cut off from reinforcements and supplies, which implies that the Germans have cut in behind them and hold at least part of the railroad toward Andelsness. From the British side, we hear only that their troops in the Donbass area fell back to prepared positions, but reports in Stockholm say the Germans are steadily advancing. Apparently, their forces have concentrated now in the Gudbrands Valley and around Donbass. For semi-official Norwegian reports made public in Sweden say that a small force of Norwegians, aided by Swedish volunteers, captured Röhris in the Öster Valley by a surprise attack at dawn and drove the German garrison some 25 miles down the valley. If this is correct, it seems to imply that the Germans no longer feel it necessary to keep much of a force in the Öster Valley when they are able to control the Gudbrands Valley with its double-track railroad farther west. The Germans claim they have taken 5,000 prisoners, of whom about three-quarters fell into their hands when a Norwegian division, evidently far below normal strength, was forced to surrender. Meanwhile, each side is making desperate efforts to stop the inflow of the other's reinforcements. In spite of the arrival of considerable quantities of anti-aircraft artillery at Namsos, to which neutral correspondents have testified, the Germans claim that in their raids yesterday they sank a cruiser, a destroyer, and 5 transports and damaged 5 more. This would be about 24 transports put out of action in the last 3 or 4 days. But neutral reporters at Namsos say that only a gunboat and a destroyer were sunk. Censorship might have prevented them from mentioning damage to transports, but their stories of the large forces now arriving there sound as if the German claims were very much overdrawn. From Sweden comes the report of another British attack on German transports and supply ships at Marstrand, north of Göteborg, where 3 weeks ago British submarines made their first and most successful attack on a convoy. This time the attack was made by British bombing planes, and according to reports from the shore, at least one German ship was sinking in flames. It's remarkable that the British Air Force could operate so far inside the strait with German air bases in Denmark and southern Norway. But these were fiercely attacked by the British last night when recurrent raids were made on the airfields at Stavanger, Aalborg in Denmark, and Fornebu near Oslo. Little damage was done. According to the German stories, the British say there was a good deal. And as you know, the first civilian casualties were caused in England today when 2 people were killed and more than 150 wounded by the fall in a seaside town of a German plane which exploded as it hit. Ironically, the German pilot seems to have tried hard to miss the houses as he came down. From Rome comes the story that Mussolini and his foreign minister, Count Ciano, have assured the British chargé d'affaires and the American ambassador that Italy has no intention of going into the war at the present time. No information can be obtained about this in Washington, and whether such a declaration was made or not, Italian press attacks on the Allies continue. Yet the sailing of the Italian liner Rex from Naples for New York has raised the belief that Italy has no intention of becoming a belligerent while this valuable ship is on the high seas, and perhaps not till it has finished its return voyage. The labor holiday on May Day was celebrated all over Europe in different styles. In Germany, it was largely a victory celebration, with Deputy Leader Rudolf Hess boasting of Germany's building many more submarines. In France, Premier Reynaud said that the workers' fullest effort would be needed if the war was to be won. In Russia, various speakers said that Russia must prepare for the war in which the capitalistic warmongers want to involve her. In England, communists and other left-wingers were permitted to abuse the government as usual in Hyde Park. But in Sweden, communists had to stay at home, while conservative and agrarian leaders marched with the socialists in the May Day parade, and the socialist Premier Hansson declared that Sweden would defend its neutrality and independence by every means. In Washington, the House of Representatives Committee laid aside by a vote of 14-10 the Hatch bill which had passed the Senate extending the restrictions on political activity by government employees. This bill, which has been laid aside, would have forbidden campaign contributions of more than $5,000.
This is the Columbia Broadcasting System.
8:55 p.m. Eastern Daylight Saving Time. The Columbia Broadcasting System and its affiliated stations present the nightly broadcast of Elmer Davis and the news.
After the withdrawal of British forces from southern Norway, the Germans are continuing the mopping up of such Norwegian detachments as are still in the field. The small force that occupied Röhris yesterday morning fell back today as German bombers attacked it and reinforced German troops moved back into the Öster Valley. and it seems unlikely that Norwegian resistance south of Trondheim can continue much longer. Along with their other successes today, the Germans finally opened the railroad from Oslo to Bergen after fighting their way through a tunnel 3 miles long. Of the various reports as to the whereabouts of King Haakon and the Norwegian government, the most probable is the statement of a Norwegian spokesman in Stockholm that they sailed from Molde, presumably with the last of the British forces, for some point in northern Norway. This and the fact that the British troops who got out of Andalsnes were apparently transferred to the Namsos area bears out the British statement that the Norwegian campaign now enters a new phase, presumably a closing in on Narvik and perhaps an attack on Trondheim from the north. Now that the Germans will be able to push in steady streams of reinforcements, the chances of success in such an operation do not seem too bright. And it is a little difficult to see how Mr. Chamberlain could tell the House of Commons today that he was satisfied that the balance of advantage up to the present lies with the Allies, or how a subsequent British statement could say that the objective of the first phase of the campaign had been attained. The German losses were undoubtedly heavy, both in warships and in men drowned in torpedoed transports or killed and wounded in land operations. But the British objective was presumably to keep them from establishing themselves in southern Norway, and from that point of view, the campaign was a total failure. Mr. Chamberlain said that the British battle fleet had put out to sea on Sunday, April 7th, after receiving information that large German naval forces were coming out, but he failed to explain why the British, with their great naval superiority, were unable to prevent the German landings at half a dozen points on Tuesday the 9th. Neutral experts feel there must have been a very poor cooperation between British air and naval forces to permit the Germans to get the jump on them. Once the Germans had occupied the Norwegian ports, at first in very light force, they might still have been driven out the first day or two by resolute naval action if the British had been willing to risk the loss of some of their capital ships, in which at present they have a superiority of 14-2. But they risked only one at Narvik, not the most important point. It may be that the first German air attack on the British fleet on Tuesday the 9th inflicted a great deal more damage than the British have admitted. Mr. Chamberlain today, acknowledging the loss of only a few small vessels, said that 5 warships had been damaged. He didn't say what kind of warships or how badly damaged. But at any rate that day, Tuesday, April 9th, seems to have been the best chance the British had to stop the German invasion, and they failed to do it. That was also the day in which British submarines, perhaps supported by destroyers, sank several German transports in the Kattegat. But after that, the Germans got their air bases established on both sides of the straits and managed to get a continual stream of reinforcements through. Not apparently without heavy losses, but they were willing to incur losses of both ships and men to gain an important strategic advantage, which the Allies do not seem to have been. One reason why the Allies were so cautious about risking their capital ships is suggested by the passage in Mr. Chamberlain's statement in the House of Commons that the German naval losses had now made it possible to transfer some Allied naval forces to the Mediterranean, and that an Anglo-French battle fleet is on its way to Alexandria. This is evidence of the apprehension stirred up by the recent Italian press attacks on the Allies and of the many signs indicating that Italy was about to go into the war. Mussolini hasn't gone in yet, but if his activity made the Allies unwilling to take the chances they would have had to take to stop Hitler in Norway while there was still time, Italy has rendered a very valuable service to her Axis ally. Reports from Belgrade tonight said that Italy had expressed disapproval of recent Yugoslav defense measures, and while this is unconfirmed, it may hint at a possible Axis offensive in the Balkans and may explain the peculiar broadcast of the British radio to Romania, declaring that the Allies had great armies in the Near East and would be able to smash any Balkan adventure that Hitler might undertake. Mr. Chamberlain referred to the suspicion of the Allied general staffs that the Norwegian campaign was only a diversion to distract Allied forces while the Germans struck elsewhere, but the Nazis have been able to capitalize on their successes.
This is the Columbia Broadcasting System.
8:55 Eastern Daylight Time, and Columbia and its affiliated stations bring you Elmer Davis and the news.
Unusual precautions are being taken in the Netherlands tonight. All canal locks in the vicinity of Amsterdam have been closed. The Dutch radio has been shut down by government order. Outgoing telephone and teletype communications have been shut off, and any large gatherings of civilians have been prohibited in the frontier districts by the military authorities. A day or two ago, it was rumored that this would be the critical day in this latest invasion crisis, and apparently the Dutch government is taking no chances. But there is as yet no confirmation of the reports of German troop movements that have been current for the last 2 days, and stories that the German army has taken over the railroads for the weekend have been denied in Berlin, though it's admitted that there has been some limitation on ticket sales. In England, Parliament has gone off for a 12-day recess, leaving Mr. Chamberlain to see if he can reconstruct his cabinet more satisfactorily. Endeavors seem to have been made to bring the Laborites and Liberals into a coalition government, but they are said to have refused to share the responsibility, at least under Mr. Chamberlain. A meeting of the Labor Party Executive Committee tomorrow may decide whether the party would join a coalition under some other leader, most probably Lord Halifax. The French Chamber of Deputies is also in recess till a week from today, and Paris reports say that the Reynaud ministry has been much less seriously shaken by the Norwegian failure than has the British cabinet, and will probably carry on without much difficulty. A good deal may depend, however, on whether the Allies are able to take Narvik and hold enough of the northern part of the country for the Norwegian king and government to retain a foothold. The Norwegian Foreign Minister Koht is in Paris, and today urgently appealed for the sending of more troops, though the Allies already seem to have a considerable preponderance of numbers on that front. The Germans claim that their planes sank a large transport off Narvik today and cooperated with land forces in an attack on Allied positions. But a United Press dispatch from just across the Swedish frontier says that 2 Allied columns are converging on German positions east of the town, and that British planes and warships keep the garrison under fire every day. Hitler today ordered the release of all Norwegian prisoners of war except professional soldiers, which apparently means that militia and reservists are allowed to go free. For one of the reasons given was that the Norwegian civil population had not participated in the fighting. In general, Hitler said the Norwegians had fought openly and honorably, as he alleged the Poles had not. Mussolini didn't make his expected speech today in awarding medals for bravery in Ethiopia and Spain to the survivors of soldiers who were killed there. To the cheering crowds, he said nothing except, I quote, "You must accustom yourselves to my silence. Only events will break it," end quote. The Italian papers continue to be full of bellicose talk, but no action has yet followed it, and it begins to look as if Italian policy may be largely guided by uncertainty as to what Russia is going to do. This seems to be the opinion in the Balkans anyway, where dispatches from Budapest say it is now believed that neither Italy nor Germany will move, in that direction anyway, till it is known what Russia will do. This is a singular reversal of the situation a few weeks ago, when there was fear of Russian aggression in the Balkans, and what kept the region quiet and peaceful then was largely the influence of Italy. Now Italian policy seems to have created such uneasiness that the Balkans are actually feeling more cheerful because it is reported that Russian troops are massed on the frontier of Bessarabia. Probably the Romanians are not very happy about that, but the story, whether true or false, has caused a good deal of satisfaction in the other Balkan states, particularly in Yugoslavia. The Yugoslav trade delegation, which has agreed on the outline of a commercial treaty with Russia but has not finished the transaction yet, is still in Moscow, and Balkan capitals believe that it may be functioning in effect as a diplomatic delegation. However, this belief in the Balkans that the Russians are following a firm and aggressive policy there is repudiated in a dispatch tonight from Moscow, where the official news agency TASS said that Russia has repudiated the old Tsarist policy of pan-Slavism, and it is denied that the Soviet Union is encouraging Romania to help Yugoslavia if the latter state should be attacked by Italy. An order was announced today by the Russian government which stripped power from the political commissars who have hitherto had great authority in the Army and Navy. From now on, the generals and admirals are to be entirely responsible for their command. Political implications of foreign affairs do not seem to have affected this decision. It seems more probable that, as the Russian papers say, it reflects experience gained in fighting against Finns and Japanese.
This is the Columbia Broadcasting System. 8:55 Eastern Daylight Time and Elmer Davis in the news, brought you tonight by the Gillette Safety Razor Company. Just time to tell you that today's improved Gillette Blue Blade, made of steel hard enough to cut glass, has the sharpest edges ever produced. That's why it gives you the quickest, easiest shaves ever. Ask your dealer for Gillette Blue Blade.
The first day of the German blitzkrieg against the Low Countries seems to have met with only very moderate success. Both Dutch and Belgians are resisting fiercely, and the Belgians have already been reinforced by strong mechanized columns of British and French troops from the Western Front, responding to the call for help sent out by both small nations after they were invaded. The Dutch and Belgian high commands tonight flatly say the invasion has failed. German advance has been greatest where Holland and Belgium meet. They took the Dutch city of Maastricht, swarmed across the projecting tip of Dutch territory, and say they have taken some bridges on the Albert Canal in northern Belgium. Farther south, they claim to have occupied the town of Malmedy, lost to Belgium by the Treaty of Versailles. Attacks on France and Belgium through Luxembourg have been stopped so far at the frontier. The invasion of the Netherlands seems to have been held at the IJssel River, where the town of Arnhem has resisted German attacks. And many, if not most, of the parachute troops dropped all over Holland before dawn this morning have been mopped up by squads of Dutch machine gunners traveling in fast automobiles. The German claim this morning that the Dutch capital, The Hague, had been captured by troops landed on the beach was not correct. Dutch troops and warships repulsed them. Parachute troops dropped a few miles from Queen Wilhelmina's palace with the apparent intention of seizing the Dutch sovereign were stopped, our correspondent Edwin Hartrich reported in an earlier broadcast, by Dutch soldiers who fought them off in the tulip fields. Around Amsterdam, too, the parachute invaders seem to have been beaten off, but there is still fierce fighting going on in the streets of Rotterdam, the chief Dutch port. The German invasion was preceded by swarms of air raiders who attacked first, following the precedent set in Poland, Dutch and Belgian airfields, and also bombed far and wide over France. More than 20 French cities, ranging from Dunkirk and Calais on the Channel to Lyon in the south, were raided, and while apparently here, too, airfields, or in some cases radio transmitters, were the primary objective, the French government said that more than 50 civilians were killed. Raids on Paris and on the mouth of the Thames seem to have been purely for reconnaissance, but incendiary bombs were dropped on a town in southeastern England. A raid on Brussels early this morning burned several apartment houses and killed civilians, but after a Belgian protest that Brussels was an open town without troops, the Germans promised not to attack it if it remained so. A late dispatch from The Hague says that no attacks seem yet to have occurred in Holland on non-military objectives. This afternoon, however, the Germans claimed that the German city of Freiburg im Breisgau, also an open town, had been bombed and 24 civilians killed, and each side warns of reprisals if the other doesn't stop it. An air raid alarm was reported from Paris about an hour ago, and all over England, people have been warned to be on guard tonight against parachute troops dropping during the blackout. The only bombs dropped on Switzerland appear to have been a mistake, but the Swiss are conducting a general mobilization nonetheless. And just before all this began, the British announced that they had occupied Iceland, so far as we know, without protest, to prevent its seizure by Germany. Winston Churchill has replaced Neville Chamberlain as British Prime Minister and will form a coalition cabinet. Its membership has not yet been announced, but Chamberlain will stay in it somewhere. Resigning, Chamberlain said that new and drastic action must be taken to restore confidence. The French Premier Reynaud took into his cabinet the prominent extreme conservatives Louis Marin and Jean Barnégaray. Italy is still quiet, and a broadcast on the Rome radio this evening says that it was the blockade more than anything else which prompted Germany to carry the war into new regions where little resistance was expected. This is in flat contradiction of the reasons given by the Nazi leaders for the invasion. Ribbentrop's claim that occupation of the Low Countries anticipated by only a day an Allied attack on Germany with Dutch and Belgian consent, and Goebbels' argument that the Dutch and Belgian governments had plotted a revolution in Germany. And that's the news to this moment.
8:55 Eastern Daylight Time, and Columbia and its affiliated stations bring you Elmer Davis and the news.
German land forces today made some small gains, but their advance is not yet very impressive. This is a three-dimensional war, however, and their command of the air has enabled them to make plenty of trouble in both Holland and Belgium. Parachute troops were dropped at more than 25 places in the Netherlands today, and Brussels reported that German planes were flying over almost without interruption, distributing parachutists over Belgium. In most cases, these small detachments seem to have been killed or captured. But besides the actual damage they do in the interruption of communications, they compel the detachment of a considerable number of troops to deal with them. And in the Netherlands, at least, this diversion is beginning to be a serious danger. Principal centers of the parachute attack today were Rotterdam and The Hague. Swarms of parachute troops were dropped there through the day, and the Germans still hold part of Rotterdam, including the Walhaven airport. This was heavily bombed again by British planes and apparently is of little use as a landing field. But our correspondent Edwin Hartrich reported earlier that many Germans had got into Rotterdam on merchant ships under the Swedish flag, and hard fighting apparently goes on in the downtown part of the city. The Dutch hold The Hague, but have had to fight not only parachute troops, but Germans in citizens' clothes who have been firing from house windows and this morning made an unsuccessful raid on the police station. Between the plain clothes and the Dutch uniforms used by some of the Germans, it must be hard for the defenders to know just whom to fight. The German radio tonight claims that parachute troops dropped on the Belgian coast have forced their way into the town of Ostend. Nothing has been heard of this from Allied sources. It may be true and maybe not. On land, the Germans have crossed the IJssel River near Arnhem and claim the capture of that town, though the Dutch dispute this. In northeastern Holland, where Dutch plans never contemplated serious defense, the invaders have reached Groningen. The principal success claimed by the Germans today was the capture of a strategically important Belgian fort near Liège, which they say was taken by some new tactics, apparently including air bombing, which prove that modern fortifications can be captured by modern methods. And east of the Moselle, an entire German division made what seems to have been a demonstration rather than an attack on the Maginot Line. The French withdrew from their advanced posts, and against heavy artillery fire, the German attack was not pressed. There were several air raids on Amsterdam with many casualties and bombs dropped on Brussels, which the Germans yesterday promised to let alone. Mostly, however, the air forces on both sides were busy bombing communications. Allied planes raided bridges, railroad junctions, and airfields on the lower Rhine, and the German attacks on many towns in France were chiefly directed against airfields. Both sides, that is, seem to be sticking for the most part to the attack on military objectives, but of course there are civilian casualties. The French reported 148 civilians killed and more than 300 wounded today, and the Germans report several dozen casualties from the lower Rhine towns. Both British and French have denied the German story that the open town of Freiburg was bombed yesterday, but German radio announcers are saying tonight that Germany's patience is exhausted. Apparently the Dutch, Belgians, and French are expected to go on being patient. And there was news of air fighting in Norway. The British say they bombed a German cruiser off Bergen. The Germans say they hit a British battleship and cruiser off Narvik. Winston Churchill has not yet finished making up his cabinet, but he will be Minister of Defense himself and will be associated in an interwar cabinet with Lord Halifax, the foreign minister, and with ex-Premier Chamberlain and the labor leaders Attlee and Greenwood, these last three having no departmental duties. Anthony Eden, former Foreign Secretary, is to be Minister of War. A.V. Alexander, Laborite, is head of the Admiralty, and Sir Archibald Sinclair, the Liberal leader, is Air Minister. Orr, Simon, and Stanley are out. British and French Marines landed today in the Dutch West Indies at the request of the Dutch government to guard the oil refineries there. In Washington, it was said that so long as the Dutch government had requested it, this action involved no violation of the Monroe Doctrine. As for the Dutch East Indies, the Japanese Foreign Minister Arita repeated to diplomats today that it was a vital interest to Japan to preserve the status quo, and Secretary Hull repeated his recent statement that any disturbance there would be prejudicial to the security of the whole Pacific area. The White House reports that comments received on President Roosevelt's speech last night were more than 90% favorable.
This is the Columbia Broadcasting System.
5 Eastern Daylight Time and Elmer Davis in the News. Brought you tonight by the Gillette Safety Razor Company. I just can't get a decent shave. When a man says that, he doesn't use today's improved Gillette Blue Blade. Edges of the new kind, sharpened on steel of glass-cutting hardness, give you man-what shave. See for yourself. Ask your dealer for Gillette Blue Blades.
The third day of the Great Offensive was apparently quite successful for the Germans in the Netherlands, but much less so in Belgium. The German High Command claims that its troops have broken through not only the first but the second Dutch defense line and are now halfway across the country. This is denied by the Dutch, but without details so far. And in the fighting in Norway, at least, statements of the German High Command as to positions occupied almost always proved correct. The Germans seem to have occupied the northeastern Dutch provinces outside the defense lines without much resistance and have reached the sea at Harlingen. Around Amsterdam, The Hague, and Rotterdam, a steady fight continues against the fresh supplies of parachute troops dropped every night. The Germans claim that a whole infantry regiment was dropped in Rotterdam, where they seem to have been driven out of the downtown districts, but still hold some of the outskirts, as well as the Moerdijk Bridge farther to the south. The Germans also claim that a British transport was sunk and 6 others set afire by their bombers off the mouths of the Rhine today. But their claims of bombing damage have so far proved much less trustworthy than their reports of land operations. In Amsterdam and The Hague, our correspondent Edwin Hartrich reported earlier, parachute troops have been dropped dressed as women, clergymen, and Dutch soldiers, and all civilians have been ordered off the streets so that the invaders can be hunted down. The Germans furiously deny that any parachute soldiers wear disguises, but there seems to be plenty of neutral testimony that they do, and it is known that the Germans were preparing the supply of Dutch uniforms for weeks before the invasion. In Belgium, the Germans are making a pincer attack trying to cut off Liège from the north and south, but seem to have been pushed back today by Allied counter-thrusts. At 2 points yesterday, they crossed the Albert Canal, and their tanks broke through Belgian defenses in the southeastern part of the country. But attacks on the eastern defenses of Liège were repulsed, and farther south, French and Belgian troops counterattacked successfully. The Allies have never yet admitted the capture of the Eben-Emael fortress, but it seems to have been surrounded, if not lost, for fighting is going on west of it at Tongres. And of course, this attack was supported by air raids all over the Low Countries and northeastern France. An air raid alarm in Paris was heard on this network during our broadcast at 7:15 tonight. Allied air forces, however, counterattacked and claimed to have inflicted very heavy losses. German newspapers say that the battle which began on Friday will decide the fate not only of Germany and her enemies, but also of Europe and the neutrals. The Börsen-Zeitung says that countries which joined the League of Nations cannot be surprised if their houses are destroyed in the general earthquake, and that the landslide will carry with it middle-sized and small states, either assigning them new places or burying them underneath it. And Alfred Rosenberg in the Völkischer Beobachter says that this is the greatest of revolutionary wars and the beginning of the unification of Europe. An outworn era, he says, is sinking beneath the tread of the German army, end quote. These remarks may cause nervousness in such neutral countries as our left, and there was alarm in Sweden today over reports that the German army in Norway is concentrating on the Swedish frontier. Hungary mobilized 2 more divisions, but it was said that this was only for training. More ominous was the action of Italy, where Mussolini ordered immediate reinforcement of the fortifications along the French frontier, and it was reported from Rome, though not yet with official confirmation, that 4 more classes of reservists had been called up, bringing another 1 million men to the colors. This coincided with a continued press campaign against the Allies, which particularly denounced British blockade measures. Fascists also destroyed many copies of the Osservatore Romano, the Vatican newspaper. Completion of Winston Churchill's cabinet does not leave quite as good an impression as the first announcement. Best of the new men is Herbert Morrison, the vigorous Labourite, as Minister of Supply, but Sir John Simon is still there, though Sir Samuel Hoare is out. And that's the news to this moment.
(8:55) Eastern Daylight Time. And Columbia and its affiliated stations bring you Elmer Davis and the news.
On the 4th day of the invasion of the Low Countries, the Germans are ahead of schedule, according to statements in Berlin. But as in Norway and Poland, their advances have been made by fast armored divisions, and the mass of troops has not yet caught up with them. Accordingly, there is a different front on almost every road. One of these armored columns seems to have struck into Liège from the northwest, and according to the German statement, holds the city, though it is admitted that the forts east of it are not yet taken. Another armored force, probably striking up from the southeast, established contact with German parachute troops near the strategic Moerdijk Bridge south of Rotterdam, the chief where communication between Belgium and the heart of Holland has been cut. But farther east, Dutch troops are still fighting along the IJssel and Maas rivers, though the German infantry may be able to pour through the breaks in their lines made by the armored divisions. Amsterdam again spent a busy day cleaning out German troops, parachute troops, and German agents, and in Rotterdam, the Germans were again, after early advances, driven back to the south side of the river. This armored column which has crossed the Moerdijk Bridge, however, may be able now to reinforce the German troops in Rotterdam. The entire Dutch royal family went over to England today, accompanied by the chief members of the cabinet, and a broadcast tonight by the British Broadcasting Corporation says that this was due to a deliberate German attempt to capture Queen Wilhelmina. They tried to do that by a parachute attack on Friday, which failed, but there were further attempts to capture the Queen, and she was well aware of the political complications that might arise if she were taken prisoner. General Winkelmann, commanding the Dutch army, is apparently left in charge in the Netherlands. The German advance in northern Belgium is also chiefly the work of 3 armored divisions that turned the flank of the main Belgian defenses after the still unexplained capture of Fort Eben-Emael on Saturday. French tanks fought a furious battle against German tanks at Saint-Cloud, 15 miles northwest of Liège, and British tanks were in action farther west. But on each side, the main forces have not yet come up. In the extreme southeastern part of Belgium, severe German attacks drove back the advanced French forces beyond the frontier and in some cases beyond the Meuse River. But the French say that heavy German pressure against the French towns of Longwy and Montmédy was withstood. This brings the German attack close to the valuable Briey iron fields. And the air war went on today all over the Low Countries with great damage done to many towns, especially in Belgium. Our correspondent Edwin Hartrich reports from Amsterdam that German mass bombing flights over the Netherlands have been pretty well broken up by Dutch fighter planes acting on radio orders like cruising police cars, but small groups of bombers are still active. And powerful units of the British fleet are in action off the Dutch coast. Reports from Stockholm say the Germans are still pushing on in Norway. Troops were landed today at Bodø, about 100 miles south of Narvik, apparently from ships that managed to reach that point by keeping close along shore. There is increasing alarm in Sweden over the concentration of German troops just over the Norwegian border and mysterious movements of large German ships just outside of Swedish territorial waters. In Italy, the anti-British campaign goes on to such an extent that reports from Rome say that British subjects have been advised by their consuls to leave the country. Despite increasing threats of the fascist press, however, that Italy will soon take action, neutral observers are far from convinced. Meanwhile, it is pointed out that the threatening Italian attitude immobilizes a considerable part of the French Army and Air Force on the Italian frontier, besides the Allied fleets in the Mediterranean, so that Mussolini is already rendering considerable strategic service to Hitler. Winston Churchill made his first speech to Parliament as Prime Minister today, and his new government got a unanimous vote of confidence in both houses. Churchill said that the British people had before them many long months of struggle and suffering. "I have nothing to offer you," he said, "but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. Our aim is victory, however long and hard the road may be, for without victory there is no survival." End quote. Evidently, the British have taken to heart the German statements that this war that began last Friday is a world revolution. And in Washington, there was fresh agitation as to the condition of American defenses. President Roosevelt will send a special message to Congress this week asking for more defense appropriations, which, according to Washington reports tonight, will be largely devoted to anti-aircraft and anti-tank guns, and it is proposed already to raise the debt limit.
This is the Columbia Broadcasting System. 8:55 Eastern Daylight Time, and Columbia and its affiliated stations bring you Elmer Davis and the news.
Hitler added another to his bag of small nations today, the fifth in 14 months, when the Dutch army laid down its arms everywhere except in the extreme southwestern part of the country. And even there, the Germans have almost reached the sea. Earlier, the Germans had extended their breakthrough of the Dutch second line south of Amersfoort and were nearing Utrecht, while the armored column that had struck clear across the country yesterday was coming up against Rotterdam, which was being blasted by heavy air attacks. So General Winkelmann, the Dutch commander-in-chief, ordered the surrender of these two positions. A little later, he broadcast an order for general surrender, for he said, I quote, "If we had fought on, not only our army would have been destroyed, but all civilians, women and children, because in such a populated country it is impossible to avoid killing civilians when bombing is aimed at military objectives." End quote. It is emphasized, however, that the Dutch government has not made peace or asked for it. Many Dutch cities have suffered heavily from the German bombers, while much of downtown Rotterdam is said to have been wrecked by Dutch artillery blasting out parachute troops. The Germans claim their bombers sank 2 British cruisers and damaged 2 transports in Dutch waters today, and now they will have air bases within 150 miles of London. In Belgium, Germans who had turned the flank along the Dutch frontier struck down to the east of Turnhout and fought a heavy battle with British, French, and Belgian mechanized forces east of Louvain. This battle seems to have been indecisive, though both sides claim the advantage, and fighting is going on between the Hete and Dial rivers. Still another German flanking force struck straight southward behind the Belgian frontier defense positions, which apparently are still held, and joined the German forces that had pushed up through Luxembourg and southeastern Belgium. These troops this morning captured the French city of Sedan, but the French insist that attacks elsewhere, the heaviest at Longwy, have been repulsed and that their own troops have counterattacked. The German assaults, say the French, has only reached the outer fringes of the Maginot Line, which here, however, is not so strong as along the eastern border. In France, as in Belgium, the Germans are apparently trying to outflank the strongest defenses. Naturally, these victories caused jubilation in Germany, and WWII, head of the Labor Front, wrote in a Berlin paper, I quote, "We are firmly convinced that Hitler will soon bring Europe and the whole world to reason and thereby make Europe and the whole world happy. This mission was entrusted to him by God and nature," end quote. The German Air Force again seems to have been the principal factor in the day's victories, though the smaller Allied forces fought back hard. Not much was heard about parachute troops today, but Anthony Eden, the new British War Minister, began organizing a local defense corps against expected parachute attacks on the British Isles. This force, to include anybody under 65 who can use a rifle, will be organized and uniformed. But a German broadcast tonight spoke of its members as civilian snipers and warned that Germany would apply to them the same measures that were used in Poland. Italy is still non-belligerent, but mobs continue to burn French and British flags, and the newspapers are full of war talk. Neutral diplomats begin to feel that Mussolini may come in any time now. Hungary is massing troops along the Slovak border, but it is uncertain whether this is a forecast of general action in the Balkans or only another move in Hungary's private quarrel with the Slovaks. And from Norway comes the news that the Allies are closing in on Narvik. In this country, stock and grain markets went tumbling, and in Washington there was a spreading realization that this country is none too well prepared for hemisphere defense. At the close of a day in which all Washington had been talking armaments, General Pershing issued this statement, I quote, "In my opinion, the very life of this republic depends on the energy and determination with which our people undertake a task of placing the United States in a state of thorough preparation in both men and equipment. The time factor should be the dominant consideration. This country must within itself be prepared for whatever instant action is required for our security," end quote from General Pershing. In line with this emphasis on the time factor, it was proposed in Congress today that all naval construction be put on a 3-shift basis. President Roosevelt will send a message to Congress today or tomorrow proposing new defense appropriations, which will probably be pretty heavy, and which, according to report, will largely be devoted to anti-tank and anti-aircraft guns. There is support in Congress for the creation of a joint committee of both houses on defense, and some demand that Congress remain in continuous session. But the President said today he thought that was unnecessary.
This is the Columbia Broadcasting System. 8:55 Eastern Daylight Time, and Columbia and its affiliated stations bring you Elmer Davis and the news.
On the 12th day of the offensive, German armored columns struck down the valley of the Somme, captured Amiens, thus cutting rail connections between Paris and the northern Channel ports, and pushed on to the sea at Abbeville. The German High Command, however, has not claimed that more than armored divisions have got this far, though unofficial German sources say that considerable numbers of infantry are following them. Advanced motor forces are striking northward up the coast, but are meeting not only land opposition, but the fire of warships in the Channel. Another German column, protecting the flank of the one moving down the Somme Valley, took Arras 25 miles to the north. A mass attack by the German Air Force finally deciding a long infantry battle. By these successes, the Allied armies have been cut in two, or to put it another way, the advanced German forces are between two Allied masses. Northwest of Reims, the French are attacking the flank of the German Bulge in the direction of Laon and La Fère, and there are counterattacks from the other side, too. By the thrust to Abbeville, some 700,000 British, French, and Belgian troops are more or less encircled by the Germans with their backs to the Channel from Boulogne to Ostend. They can do only two things: try to escape across the Channel, for which there cannot be enough available shipping, or try to cut their way out, and this last is what they are doing. Continual counterattacks are going on around Cambrai and Valenciennes. The Germans say that the French only are taking part in them, while the British are trying to escape across the Channel under bombardment from the German Air Force. But this seems only a repetition of the familiar German propaganda endeavor to create discord between the Allies, which is already leading to German hints of an offer of a separate peace to France. The French military spokesman says that the British also are battling the Germans in northern France, And apparently most of the British Air Force is operating in France, leaving the British troops in Belgium with very little air support. The German Air Force was methodically destroying towns all through northern France today with high explosive and incendiary bombs, and was using parachute troops to disrupt communications. All correspondents report that the Germans have derived an immense advantage from the displacement of population caused by these attacks on a thickly inhabited region. Crowds of refugees, numbering millions according to some estimates, from wrecked and burning towns are crowding the roads and often hamper Allied motor columns in operations where time is of the utmost importance. Some stories have said that the failure to destroy strategic bridges was due to the fact that they were crowded with refugees at the critical moment. And there have been many reports of German planes bombing and machine gunning refugee columns. Apparently, the Germans now regard all northern France as a military objective. Premier Reynaud, in a speech to the French Senate today, candidly admitted that the breakthrough on the Meuse was a disaster due to an overestimate of the natural strength of the position, which left it defended by an inadequate number of poorly trained troops. But he insisted that France would win if its people showed the same spirit as in the last war. And the German commander in Belgium told a United Press correspondent today that so far there have been only preliminary encounters and the decisive action had not yet taken place. A diplomatic effect of the German successes appeared today when the Russian government rejected the British proposal for trade negotiations that was made some time ago. Whatever Stalin hoped for from this war, he seems to feel now that he has to play ball with Hitler. Italy still remains non-belligerent, but the governor of Gibraltar ordered the evacuation of all women and children from that fortress today, and presumably he was thinking of an Italian attack, as he said he was sure Spain would remain neutral. In Washington, congressional committees hurried action on defense appropriation bills, and the Navy Department ordered government Navy yards to go on a two-shift schedule. The president said at his press conference, however, that he would like to see a 40 or 42-hour week maintained and that social gains achieved under the New Deal will not be weakened. He said that industry should have a fair profit, but there should be no profiteering, and that labor should not seek special increments in wages from the situation. A number of national leaders, including Republicans, will be brought into the government, he said, but apparently not into the cabinet. Reconstitution of the War Industries Board of the last war is not contemplated. Former President Hoover wrote tonight to Senator Tobey of New Hampshire in response to a question that he could see no objection to Republicans serving in the cabinet as individuals, but he said they would not represent their party. Our people will differ, said Mr. Hoover, in opinion as to the best methods of keeping out of the war, and there should be debate on policy.
This is the Columbia Broadcasting System. (8:55) Eastern Daylight Time, and Columbia and its affiliated stations bring you Elmer Davis and the news.
Today's fighting was confused, obscure, and still indecisive, but the Allies seem to have counterattacked more effectively than at any time since the breakthrough last Thursday. Arras was retaken this morning, according to a French official statement. And while the Germans do not admit this, the French stick to their story and say that a battle described as chaotic took place to the eastward of Arras from Cambrai to Valenciennes. Here the Allied army based on the Channel ports, though still encircled, has gained itself more elbow room and is trying to meet other French forces moving up from St. Quentin. If this movement is completed, the Germans in the Somme Valley will be encircled. Reports that the French had retaken Abbeville on the Channel are not confirmed in Paris, where they admit they don't know the situation on the coast. However, German claims that they have extended their lines 30 miles up the shore are ridiculed by the French, who say that this might refer to a dash by a small group of motorcyclists. Farther east, the Germans have captured Rethel, and it was said in Berlin that it was most likely that they had taken Soissons, but this was not positively claimed and is not confirmed. And our Paris correspondent, Mr. Grandin, reported that there is some action now along the real Maginot Line. Practically all this information, except the French story of the recapture of Arras, comes from unofficial or semi-official sources. The French official communique tonight said nothing definite at all, neither did the German communique this morning, and tonight we have had no statement from the German High Command. It seems probable that neither General Headquarters really knows much about what is going on in this confusion of interlocking battles, and perhaps still more probable that each side is afraid to tell what it does know for fear of giving the enemy information which he does not yet possess. The Germans say that today they drove the Dutch out of maritime Flanders, the strip of Dutch territory just west of Antwerp, and that their forces moving south from that area are fighting desperately around Ghent and on the upper Scheldt. This is, of course, a blow at the left flank of the Channel Army, whose right flank is engaged at Cambrai. But our correspondent Russell Hill reported this evening that military circles in Berlin do not expect any quick victory, and the general tone of the Germans seems somewhat less confident than in the last few days. The British Air Force continued its night raids on Germany, attacking particularly the railroad yards at Aachen and Krefeld. And the Germans say their bombers sank a cruiser and several merchantmen in the Channel. Also, they appear to be using fast motor torpedo boats against Channel shipping. And after days of fair, dry weather favorable to the operation of planes and tanks, there was rain in France today. The French are hoping for more. What our London correspondent, Mr. Murrow, describes as the British Revolution occurred today peacefully and constitutionally when within 3 hours Parliament passed a bill giving the government full control over all persons and property. This was the summary of the measure by Major Attlee, leader of the Labour Party and member of the War Cabinet, who presented it to the House of Commons. The government can dictate production, expand or shut down factories, destroy property when necessary, draft anybody's labor for any purpose, and will impose 100% tax on excess profits. The bill passed with practically no argument. Minister of Supply Herbert Morrison ordered all British munitions factories on a 24-hour day, 7 days a week. It was announced by the Allied Purchasing Mission that British and French planes bought here are in some cases being flown across the Atlantic, presumably from Newfoundland. They cannot, of course, be flown from this country to either Newfoundland or Canada under the neutrality law. After lunching with the President today, Governor Landon said that Republican leaders could join the Cabinet in a coalition administration only if the President would announce that he would not take a third-term nomination even if offered. If he would eliminate himself, said Mr. Landon, he would become the leader of the nation instead of the head of a party. In response to this, Mr. Roosevelt said tonight, I quote, "The President regrets that he has not the time just now to give to the preparation of political statements," end quote. It was reported in Washington that the President had offered to make Mr. Landon, Colonel Frank Knox, and Colonel William J. Donovan Secretaries of War, the Navy, and Labor, respectively. The State Department tonight advised all Americans in the British Isles who want to come home to proceed to Galway, Ireland, where the liner President Roosevelt will be sent to bring them back. Belligerent governments are asked to look after the voyage and see that nothing happens to it. And tonight at 10:30 Eastern Daylight Time, Senator James F. Burns of South Carolina will speak on most of these stations, replying to Colonel Lindbergh.
This is the Columbia Broadcasting System. (8:55 Eastern Daylight Time), and Columbia and its affiliated stations bring you Elmer Davis and the news.
After another day of furious fighting in which each side scored local successes, the Battle of Northern France and Western Belgium is still undecided. The principal German success was the drive of a motorized column as far as the French Channel port of Boulogne, where Prime Minister Churchill said heavy fighting was going on. If this German force should manage to hold the port, it would, of course, be a serious blow to the Allies. But how strong the German column is, we don't know. Meanwhile, the Allied army in Belgium, holding its positions on the left wing along the Scheldt River, struck again with its right wing at the Germans around Cambrai and Valenciennes. The Germans admit the Allies gained some slight advantages, but say it was nothing decisive. And the French, coming up from the south, fought their way into the outskirts of Amiens. So it is still too early to be sure whether the Allied Channel Army will be cut off by the Germans or the German Channel Force cut off by the Allies. The Germans made another hard attack this morning to the east of the point where they broke through the French defenses a week ago, assaulting the works between Longuyon and the Moselle River, though apparently without result. In Paris, military spokesmen seem to think this is the beginning of an attempt to get in the rear of the real Maginot Line along the eastern frontier. But in Berlin, it is treated as rather a holding attack designed to prevent a French counteroffensive against the southern flank of the German Bulge. German spokesmen are telling correspondents in Berlin that England, not Paris, is the main objective. But French military authorities think that Hitler will try to beat down all resistance in France before he goes all out in an attack on England. This seems more probable than the German story, which appears to be tied up with the propaganda offensive that is designed to persuade or terrorize the French into making a separate peace. Air activity was reported as less today on account of bad weather. But the Germans claimed they bombed over, though the British say the planes were beaten off before they ever reached the English shores, while the British Air Force, again attacking communications, blew up 2 German munition trains. The British government locked up Sir Oswald Mosley, leader of the British fascists, and Captain A.H.R. Ramsay, a member of Parliament of outspoken pro-fascist tendencies, besides some minor figures in the movement. It was emphasized that this was not done on account of their opinions, but for fear the fascist organization might be used for acts endangering the state. And now the British are beginning to worry about the possibility that the German attack on England, if and when it comes, will include a blow from the rear, beginning with the seizure of neutral Ireland. Major Attlee, speaking for the War Cabinet, told the House of Commons today that information about this situation had been exchanged with Premier de Valera. And Deputy Prime Minister Sean T. O'Kelly of IRA said in Dublin that the de Valera government would resist any foreign efforts to take advantage of or exploit the Irish people for the sake of some other country. He added that he hoped the national ideal of unification of Ireland would be achieved, but without any outside interference. And in Northern Ireland, which unlike IRA is at war, a home defense corps is being organized to deal with parachute troops. In Washington, the Senate passed the Navy bill, and the War Department began letting contracts for gas masks and airplanes. But meanwhile, a speculation that has been whispered around Washington for some time and was alluded to by Senator Burns in his broadcast over this network last night finally came out in news dispatches. The possibility that if Hitler wins a smashing victory in France and breaks British power, whether by air bombing or by invasion, the British fleet might pass into his hands almost intact. It seems to have been suggested in London and Paris that he might demand surrender of the fleet as a ransom for sparing England the ultimate horrors of air war. And while this idea may doubtless have been put out partly for its effect on American opinion, responsible persons in Washington evidently regard it as a serious possibility. The German fleet is small, but the British fleet, which does not seem to have sustained serious losses so far, is about the size of our own. Naval strategists say that if it were transferred to other hands, it would be essential to defense of the Monroe Doctrine to bring our fleet back from Hawaii to Atlantic or Caribbean ports, and that the probable first consequence of that would be Japanese occupation of the Netherland Indies, from which we get most of our tin and rubber. Mr. Landon had a long talk with Secretary Hull today and said afterward that he believed the United States must participate in economic settlements in Europe after the war. He also said he thought opposition leaders ought to have full information bearing on foreign policy. And Mr. Hoover said that cooperation, not coalition, was entirely feasible.
This is the Columbia Broadcasting System.
The remnant of the Allied army in Flanders, which according to some French sources still numbers nearly 100,000 men, found itself crowded in today by a German attack which took Newport and then, striking down a coast road, reached a point within 6 miles of Dunkirk. Hard fighting is still going on, however, and the efforts to evacuate the troops continue, though it is admitted that most of their material has to be left behind. The Germans say that yesterday their Air Force sank 4 warships and 11 transports, besides damaging many more. But some suspicion is cast on these claims by their precise estimates of the tonnage of the shipping, which aviators in action would hardly be able to judge. The British claim that in the past 2 days they have shot down 125 German planes at the cost of only 32 of their own. Whatever the accuracy of this estimate, the fact that Germany called tonight for more volunteers for the Air Force and parachute troops suggests that these highly trained forces have suffered heavy loss in the past 3 weeks. There was some local fighting on the Somme today in which the French say the Germans were repulsed, and there was another German air raid down the Rhone Valley. Again, the German planes flew over Switzerland, and again one of them was shot down. Italians, that Germany could take vigorous air action in southeastern France, which is borne out by the implications of the report of our Rome correspondent Cecil Brown earlier this evening. The best unofficial information in Rome, said Mr. Brown, is that Mussolini has promised Hitler that Italy will come in this month, and it is believed that the date will be somewhere around June 15th. This will coincide with a new German attack, perhaps on France and England simultaneously, while Italy also will strike at several points so that the Allies will be engaged everywhere. It was believed, however, that Italy would stand on the defensive on the French frontier and would not attack Yugoslavia. Where the attack may come is hinted by stories in the Italian papers that Turkey has asked Greece for permission to send troops into that country. which suggests that Italy may find it necessary to protect the neutrality of Greece as Hitler did that of Norway, Denmark, and the Low Countries. This frank exposition of Italian intentions is borne out to some extent by the character of the propaganda with which the Italian government has been stirring up its people to go to war. The well-known Italian editor, Giovanni Ansaldo, in his weekly broadcast, said today that Italy must go in for a moral reason. I quote, "The Italian people cannot be absent from a great occasion which is preparing the new destiny of continents," end quote. But Italian papers keep insisting that Germany has already won the war, which carries the implication that Italy will not come in if there is any danger of losing. Evidently, then, Mussolini thinks one quick blow this summer will finish it off, for that sort of propaganda is hardly the way to nerve up a nation for a long war in which it might sustain some reverses. The Pope, addressing the College of Cardinals today, expressed his paternal love for all the warring peoples and deplored certain effects of the war. I quote, "The progressive annihilation of spiritual values, the gradual disappearance of rules of right, and force which is suppressing and choking legal and national rights," end quote. The Italians are now hoping that not only Spain will follow them in, but perhaps even Romania, after the appointment of a pro-German Romanian foreign minister yesterday. It's not clear just whom the Romanians are expected to fight. But the Anglo-French treaty with Turkey, drawn in a clear expectation of war with Italy, commits Turkey to come in if Italy moves in the Mediterranean, and Turkey is making defense measures for protection. And in this country, perhaps the most important news of the day is that the shipyard strike at Kearney, New Jersey, where 4 warships are under construction, has been called off. The men voted to go back to work pending negotiations with the company. And that's the news to this moment.
8:55 Eastern Daylight Time, and Columbia and its affiliated stations bring you Elmer Davis and the news.
The first great air raid on Paris, which took place today, evidently had 2 objectives. The only one the Germans admit was the airfields in the suburbs, particularly at Issy on the southwestern edge of town and the nearby Air Ministry. This building appears to have been hit, though the censorship forbids the direct admission, but not seriously damaged. One bomb narrowly missed the American ambassador Bullitt, who was lunching with the minister. More than 900 of the 1,000 bombs dropped fell in the suburbs, but one flight of planes was evidently aiming at the government buildings on the Seine in the center of Paris. It missed them, but damaged many apartment houses and started at least one fire on the riverfront. Many of the bombs were either incendiary or of the delayed explosion type, and 61 fires were started, most of which were soon under control. But it is probable that the casualty list will run much higher than the 50 killed and 150 wounded so far officially announced. 5 schools and a hospital were among the buildings hit. About 150 planes in 6 waves took part in the raid, and considering that anti-aircraft fire kept them 5 or 6 miles up, their marksmanship seems to have been pretty good. 17 of them were shot down. The French report that most of the German troops in Flanders are being transferred to the front east of Paris, along the Oise and Aisne rivers and the Argonne forest, apparently in preparation for a new offensive. But enough of them have been left around Dunkirk to keep up a hard fight with the Allied forces there, which are still being withdrawn, once more aided by fog. The British Admiralty issued a report on the evacuation operation, which admitted the loss of 6 destroyers and 24 other vessels, all small, including a number of trawlers and several river excursion boats. Many of these were doubtless mistaken by the German flyers who sank them for larger vessels, which might account for a good deal of the discrepancy between the British and German reports on the shipping losses. The Admiralty said that the number of troops brought back would surprise the world, but it has not yet given the number, perhaps because the operations are not complete. Meanwhile, the Germans claim that since the 10th of May, they have taken nearly 1.25 million prisoners, 400,000 Dutch, 500,000 Belgians, 330,000 British and French. Since practically all the Dutch army and most of the Belgian army eventually surrendered, and most of the British and French wounded had to be left behind, this figure does not appear impossible. But it is hard to believe the statement of some other German sources, which is not an official claim, that their own casualties in more than 3 weeks of terrific fighting were only 50,000, just about the number they say they lost in Poland. Credulity is still further strained by the statements officially made by the German government today to the American chargé d'affaires in Berlin. One of them accuses the British and French Secret Service of plots to blow up not only the liner President Roosevelt, now bringing Americans back from the British Isles, but the liner Manhattan coming back from Genoa and the Washington, which is on its way to Bordeaux to take off refugees. The German story says that the Allies planned to sink these ships and then blame the Germans so as to excite America to get into the war. And it was added that, I quote, Germany expects the United States government to take all necessary steps to prevent such a crime as the British plan to commit, end quote. Any alarm that may be felt for these ships and their passengers should be moderated by the recollection that the Germans told a similar story about another American liner last fall, but nothing ever happened to it. And perhaps some of the American warships now in European waters may be used to convoy some of these vessels. And still another official communication from the German government to the governments of the United States, Mexico, and Panama insisted that the British Secret Service has sent large numbers of agents to Mexico and Central America to try to sabotage the canal and to stir up trouble in Mexico, for which, of course, the Germans will again be blamed so that American feeling will be aroused. This, too, is reminiscent of the stories told by the Germans about activities of British secret agents in other countries of Europe. Meanwhile, reports from Mexico indicate that if the British have any agents there, they must be pretty well disguised, for the persons who are making the trouble look to most people like Germans. As for Italy, it's the same old story, apparently a little nearer to war every day, but not yet in it. Mussolini convokes his Council of Ministers tomorrow, but it does not seem to be expected in Rome that war will come immediately, although Foreign Minister Count Ciano is expected to report to the meeting on recent diplomatic exchanges with the United States and the reasons why President Roosevelt's endeavors to keep Italy at peace have got nowhere.
This is the Columbia Broadcasting System.
8:55 Eastern Daylight Time, and Columbia and its affiliated stations bring you Elmer Davis and the news.
With the German occupation of Dunkirk this morning, the Battle of Flanders came to an end. The Allies say they got their last troops out. The Germans claim they took 40,000 prisoners. Against that, Prime Minister Churchill told the House of Commons today that British casualties in killed, wounded, and missing had been only 30,000, while the Germans insist that their own losses since the battle started on May 10th are only 61,000. Both these figures seem extraordinarily low. If they are anywhere near correct, it means that mechanized war can achieve tremendous decisions at a relatively small cost in life. Churchill frankly told Parliament that the battle had been a colossal disaster, and though he said that 335,000 troops had been brought out, he admitted the loss of 1,000 guns and all the transport and armored vehicles. The French, however, say that the retreating troops systematically destroyed the supplies and materials left behind. German claims that in the course of recent operations they have destroyed more than 3,500 Allied planes at the cost of only 432 of their own, are countered by Churchill's assertion that the British Air Force inflicted losses of more than 4-1. Churchill went on to say that he believed the British Isles could be successfully defended and that the British and French would aid each other to the utmost of their strength. But, he added, and I quote, "We will fight alone if necessary. We shall never surrender, and even if, which I do not for a moment believe, this island is subjugated and starving, then our empire overseas, guided and armed and guarded by the British fleet, will carry on the struggle until in God's good time the new world with all its power and might sets out to the rescue of the old." End quote from Mr. Churchill. Senator Pittman in Washington told reporters that, I quote, "This substantially guarantees the Western Hemisphere against successful attack for a long time," end quote. This remark doubtless reflects the feelings of many Americans who have considered the situation this country would be in if the British Navy fell into the hands of an aggressive power. But nothing in Mr. Churchill's speech seems to justify the view that the British Navy would defend the Western Hemisphere for our sake, though it does permit the inference that the center of the empire might be transferred to Canada. Mr. Churchill further said that wars are not won by evacuations and that the Allies would not fight a defensive war. The British Expeditionary Force, he said, would be reconstituted, and it was announced tonight that part of it was already in position beside the French along the Somme. However, this cannot be very heavily equipped, or else it's not a very large force. Nothing much happened on the land fronts today, but air raids continue on both sides. The Germans bombed the French port of Havre for 3 hours last night and attacked it again tonight. In the first attack, many fires were started by incendiary bombs. The full casualty list in yesterday's raid on Paris is more than 900, including 254 killed. It does not seem to be denied by the French that Paris contains legitimate military objectives, But so does any other city, Berlin, for instance, which has government offices and railroads used by the Army. Nevertheless, Allied raids in retaliation last night struck not at Berlin, but at Munich and Frankfurt, where the French say they bombed airfields and industrial objectives, and the Germans admit casualties in an automobile factory near Munich. The British were also busy raiding some of the cities of the Ruhr, but most of their attacks appear to have been directed at railroads and oil supplies for the German Air Force at various points in Belgium and Holland. This is, of course, another phase of the advantage the Germans gain by fighting always on somebody else's territory. The meeting of the Italian Council of Ministers today passed without any actual entry into the war, though several measures were taken which were steps toward war. Neutral opinion in Rome still thinks Italy will come in about June 15th, and the Allies apparently have to wait till Mussolini picks his time. The government departments are to be removed from Rome so that will be an open city, not subject to air bombing. In Washington, the president gave details of the request for more funds for defense he mentioned in his message last week, totaling nearly $1,300 million. The House Ways and Means Committee voted to lift the debt limit by $4 billion and to prepare to raise $1 billion by taxes. An embargo was laid by the government on the export of machine tools, many of which are going to Russia, so that needs of the defense program can be met. Debate over the president's request for authority to call the National Guard into service in an emergency is still going on. It was supported today by General Marshall, the Chief of Staff, who said the problem depends on events that may happen in the Western Hemisphere in the next month or two.
This is the Columbia Broadcasting System.